Likutei Sichos, Chelik Tesvav, that's volume 15, the first sicha for parsha Lecha. Before we begin the sicha, I'd like to go over a few points. You see, this parsha Lecha, is where we begin to learn, and then we'll continue to find out more and more about the life, the career of the founder of our nation, the founder of our faith, Avrohom Avinu, our father Abraham. Now, the truth is, we kind of heard about him already in last week's parsha, as he was, quote, born at the end. The news of his birth is already shared with us at the end of last week's parsha. Another interesting point is that if you really look at the first three parshiot, that is Bereshis, Noach, Lecha, of the Torah, it doesn't look like it doesn't seem like it, but if you really look closely, it actually spans 20 generations. Okay, the first parsha, Bereshit, up to Noach is about 10 generations. It covers very briefly, very quickly, it is 10 generations. And then from Noach until Lecha now, where it really begins to detail the life of Avram, is also another 10 generations. Now, this sicha actually was not said, so to speak, in conjunction with this parsha in particular. It's actually an explanation from the Rabbi, a very amazing insight into the difference between the first 10 generations of since creation and the second 10 generations, these two periods. This is actually a talk from the Rabbi that was said more in the summertime, meaning it was an explanation on a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, a Mishnah in the Ethics of the Fathers, namely in chapter 5. And we're going to go through some of these Mishnahs now. And there the Rebbe explained and elaborated, because there the Mishnah discusses the contrast between these two time periods. So let's first focus and let's get a quick familiarity with these Mishnahs, so we have a better appreciation of this sicha, of this talk of the Rebbe. So the first Mishnah, the first paragraph that is, in chapter 5 of the Ethics of the Fathers says, quote, with 10 utterances God created the world. Why did he create the world with 10 utterances? He could have done it with one. So, and I'm paraphrasing, says the Mishnah, the reason for it is, he went into this elaboration in order to bring retribution from the wicked ones. Follow these words, bring retribution from the wicked ones who destroy the world, through their actions that is, and to bring more reward, good reward to the righteous ones, to the tzaddikim, those who work on lekayem et haolam, to sustain the world. That is the first Mishnah, the first paragraph. The next Mishnah says also something about the number 10, and that is that there are 10 generations from Adam, that is from the first man that God created, until Noach. 10 generations. And why would the 10 generations? Says the Mishnah. Why 10? Why this long period of time? Says the Mishnah, because God has an abundance of erech hapayim, of patience. This is to tell us about God's great patience, that all these generations were repeatedly and continuously angering him and doing all these terrible wicked things, and yet he waited all full 10 generations until it came to Noach, and that's when he brought upon them the flood and he destroyed the world. The second part of the Mishnah says there are 10 generations from Noach until Avrohom. To tell us what? That to tell us how patient Hashem is, how great his patience is, that all these generations from Noach to Avram were also continuously and consistently angering Hashem, yet Hashem waited until Avrohom came, and through his righteousness he took the reward of all of them. In a later Mishnah, if you look in chapter 5, in a later Mishnah, that is in Mishnah 6, Mishnah Vav, the 6th paragraph, over there it also tells us about 10 things, 10 matters related to the creation of the world. And it says over there, quote, 10 things were created on the very last moment of Friday, right before Shabbat came in, right before the day of rest came in, when God, so to speak, totally ceased any whatsoever operations, any whatsoever work. Okay, so notice that it's only later that he talks about what occurred on the end of the 6 days of creation. So, obviously, this sicha is going to focus on mostly the second Mishnah. The second Mishnah, which speaks about the contrast from the 10 generations that began at Adam and culminate with Noach, and they got destroyed, versus the next 10 generations from Noach to Avrohom, which although they were not righteous by any means, in fact they were wicked, very similar to those prior to them, to their predecessors, and yet Avrohom comes and gets their reward. And that's precisely the question. What reward did Avrohom receive? What reward is there that Avrohom received? The statement is that they also angered Hashem, that they did wicked things. So what reward is there? And then question number 2, if there is some kind of reward, meaning that for whatever good deeds they did have, since they were wicked and they couldn't receive the reward, therefore it went to the tzaddik, it went to the righteous one who completed the 10 generations, then how come Noach did not receive any reward? Why is it that Noach, at the end of his 10 generation period, although they were all destroyed, but whatever good there was in the world throughout those 10 generations, the reward of that should have gone to him? But perhaps you can say, well, it's obvious. There was no reward to be given. There was no reward to be dispensed, not even to Noach. Why? Because they were so terribly wicked. They were so bad that there's no reward. But then this begs for an understanding. The question, if that's the case, then what really is the contrast? What really is the difference between the first 10 generations, that there was absolutely no reward to be dispensed at all, and therefore Noach received no reward, to the second period, the next 10 generations, where there seems to have been some kind of reward that the Mishnah indicates it was allotted to Avrohom because of his great righteousness. What is this all about? So first of all, there are those commentaries that explain the difference between Noach and Avrohom. Why Noach didn't receive any rewards from the people of his time period, those 10 generations, versus Avrohom that he did. Well, there's a reason for it. Because Noach did not pray for the people of his times. He did not also involve himself. He didn't go out of his way to try to influence the people and try to have them change their ways. Whereas Avrohom did pray, and we find that he prayed even for the wicked, even for the people of Sodom. He tried to pray on their behalf and to defend them. He felt a connection to them. And moreover, we know that his whole career, his whole life was dedicated selflessly to giving to others and to teaching others and to trying to direct them onto the right path. And therefore, Noach didn't receive anything, but Avrohom did receive the reward of all the people, even of the prior 9 generations up to him, because he kind of culminated it, he kind of completed it, and through his good deeds, he elevated. But here is the question. That is a good explanation, but there still remains an issue here that needs to be resolved. And that is, we know that if, quote, every person has a reward, meaning we say there is a reward, something is generated somewhere. Even if it's in a spiritual realm, but there is like so to speak, a spiritual place, the Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, the heaven. There is something there. There is a space. There is a, so to speak, like an allotted amount of reward. And if nobody received it, meaning if Noach didn't receive it because he wasn't deserving of it, because he did not involve himself with the people, and whereas Avrohom did receive for his past 10 generations, then where did that all go? In other words, the reward, the space in Gan Eden, who occupies it, so to speak? I know I'm speaking in very, very simple terms, but what happened with it? Where did it go? What is it being used for? Is it just kind of purposeless? Is it just there and all the reward is just sitting there, so to speak, in a dormant account and no one has any access to it? It doesn't make sense, because we know that everything that Hashem created, both in the physical and in the spiritual, both in the in all realms have to be purposeful. There has to be a use for it. It can't just sit around and do nothing and contribute nothing. So therefore, says the Rebbe, this brings us to a conclusion that we must say that besides the fact that Noach wasn't deserving, so to speak, of receiving the reward of the past 10 generations, because he didn't really connect with them and he didn't connect to them. But we must say that it's more than that. That there actually was no reward. There was no reward to be dispensed. And therefore there's no reward, there's no Gan Eden, there's no space, there's no, so to speak, accounts that are not being utilized, that are not being, that were not given a purposeful existence, a purposeful use. The question, however, is then what is the difference? We're back to the original question. What then is really the difference between the first 10 generations and the latter 10 generations? That the first 10 generations had no reward versus the latter ones that did have a reward, which Avrohom received by virtue of his connection to them, by virtue of his dedication towards them. Another interesting question in this Mishnah is, what did we say? That the first 10 generations, what is the purpose of 10 generations? That it was to show us how patient Hashem is, how much he's erech hapayim, how patient he is. And he was patient all the way till the end of the 10th generation, and then he destroyed them in the time of Noach. The question is, this is a very obvious fact. Everybody knows this already. We don't need a Mishnah for this. It is clearly written in the Torah. We say it in the 13 attributes of mercy. Hashem, Kel, Rachum, V'chanun. He is a God that is compassionate, V'chanun, erech hapayim, and he has much patience. Perhaps, it seems that maybe the novelty here in this Mishnah is, meaning what the Mishnah is trying to teach us, something which I would otherwise not know, is not that Hashem is patient, but how much he is patient, because the verse never quantifies exactly how much is the patience of Hashem, how far it goes, and therefore the Mishnah is telling us, listen, it goes for 10 generations, and here is the precedent, here is the historical proof for it, that the first 10 generations, Hashem was patient with them, only after that did he destroy them. But if that's the case, which seems to be logically the case, the question still is, why 10? What is the significance of 10? Why 10 generations? Why not 5 generations? That's also a long period of time. Especially in those days, the generations were very long. People lived very long. Why 10? What's the significance of 10? So the Rebbe says, in order to understand all of this, to really put this all in perspective, we take a moment to really to analyze, that is, the entirety of this chapter. If you look at the chapter in Pirkei Avot, and again, I invite you to look at it inside so you'll see where everything fits in. As we mentioned, in chapter 6, it discusses, quote, the 10 things that Hashem created at the very last moment of creation, as, so to speak, the sun was setting on Friday afternoon at the end of the 6th day of creation, and it enumerates all the 10 things that Hashem created. And of course, the question is, the order seems to be out of place. If you look at the first Mishnah, speaks about the 10 utterances. The 10 utterances Hashem used to create the world, and it tells us why. Makes sense. And it follows that the next Mishnah should be what? What happened towards the end of the 6 days of creation, which is Mishnah 6, paragraph 6. However, how does it appear in the Mishnah? The next Mishnah is about the 10 generations from Adam to Noach, and from Noach to Avrohom, and only later does it talk about this. The order seems to be out of whack. Well, the answer, however, is that what the Mishnah is really doing, it's obvious that what's the point of the Pirkei Avot is to tell us as follows. That in the first Mishnah, it's not just merely talking about the 10 utterances. No, it's talking about the kinds of people Hashem created. The types of behaviors that influence the world. The impact the human being has on the world. And therefore it tells us, look, Hashem used 10 utterances. In other words, it was so elaborate, this creation. It was so detailed. Because there's 2 types of people. There are, quote, the wicked, as the Mishnah says, who destroy the world by their action. And therefore, they destroyed the world by action, and therefore Hashem went through this great length in order to have a deeper and a much more emphasized retribution. And then there are the contrast that tzaddikim, the righteous ones, who they work on mekaimim et haolam, they work on sustaining the world and making the world a viable place by their action, and therefore it's so elaborate to extend and to enhance, to amplify the reward that comes to them. And therefore, following this, it makes sense that immediately the Tana, meaning the sage of the Mishnah, brings us an actual example. He qualifies it by telling us, look, this actually happened. Look at the first 10 generations, which were wicked, and they were so wicked that their actions all were such that destroyed the world, or worked on destroying the world and creating the instability. And therefore, at the end of the 10 generations, Hashem totally destroyed them. Albeit Hashem was patient and therefore took 10 generations, versus the next 10 generations that although they were not righteous, but when came about a righteous man like Avrohom, and he was able to retroactively enhance even their bad actions and elevate it, make it sustainable, to sustain it, then he got all their reward from all the good that was there. What is the real understanding behind this? In other words, it still did not explain the why. The question that we asked, why is there a difference between the first 10 generations and the last 10 generations? That Noach was also a tzaddik. Yes, he didn't connect to the people. But remember we asked the question, where's all the good, what they did? Where's the reward for all of that? It seems that there's no good whatsoever to be rewarded. Why? So the Rebbe explains that we find later in the Torah, we find sometimes what seems to be varying instruction, or in fact, it seems to almost be contradictory instruction when it comes to the collection of the war spoils. We find sometimes when the Jews went out to war, they were instructed to take the spoils, and there were times they were instructed not to take any spoils and to totally destroy it. Or sometimes within the same war, some types of spoils they could take and divide amongst the people, amongst the fighting soldiers, and the other types of spoils they were supposed to totally destroy. What is the meaning behind it? What is the spiritual meaning behind it? The idea is, and this applies to us, in our, quote, war on the Ra, on the bad, our war on evil, which really is all, that's what our lives is all about, to destroy the bad and bring out the good, that there is two types of bad. There is such bad that the only way that it can be dealt with, the only way you can deal with it is destroy it, to annihilate it, to totally get rid of it, to break it. Whereas some bad, there's such bad that, yes, it's true that when you look at it on the surface, it seems fully bad. But if one is able to really get into the depth of it, there are some good qualities there. There are what we call the sparks of good, the sparks of holiness. And if one can actually reach them and get in it, then he can make the whole thing purposeful by elevating it and bringing out the good that's in there. And this is the difference between these two time periods. The first 10 generations, there was absolutely no good. They were so bad, they were so wicked. They committed such wickedness that the only way, so to speak, Hashem had to deal with them was to totally wash them away, totally destroy them, totally get rid of them. Whereas the next 10 generations, true, it also accounts for them being very wicked, but still there was some good there. There was some good qualities, albeit very small ones, very minor ones, but enough that when Avrohom came and he elevated the world and he brought the world to a good place, he was able to elevate the retroactively, or the generations before him, and bring him to a good place. And therefore there was a reward for him to be able to receive the reward for them. And this also helps us understand why it was specifically 10 generations. Remember, we asked why the number 10? Yes, Hashem is patient, but why 10 generations? The answer is, we know that in Kedusha, the side of holiness, the number 10 is a complete number. When it comes to the holy attributes, when it comes to even, let's say, for example, a quorum, it has to be 10. 10 is a complete number. 10 is wholeness, is wholesomeness. Now, if it's so in the side of Kedusha, in the side of holiness, we know that there's also always the counterpart. Hashem made everything to counterbalance, and therefore, likewise, in the side of impurity, in the side of evil, in the side of dark, in the forces of darkness, 10 is also their, quote, complete number. And therefore, Hashem waited until it was a complete and absolute bad, until it was complete and absolute evil, and then he destroyed them. Whereas the next 10 generations, they had their saving grace, which was Avrohom, who came and elevated them and brought them up to a point where there was even, quote, the reward of whatever good there was there from all the 10 generations to be had, and therefore was had by him, it was received by him. What is the lesson for us? The lesson for us is, sometimes a person can go through a time period. The Rebbe uses the example of 10 days. And in those 10 days, sadly, the person didn't function well. Not only didn't function well, he functioned very badly and did terrible things. And sometimes that the person stops and says, look, I was behaving the way I wanted to behave. I followed the wickedness of my heart, of my desires, and look, things are good. So he says, you should know, number one, just because things are good, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing the right thing. It could be merely a result exclusively because Hashem is patient. But when it gets to the end of it, that too will stop. That too will stop. And therefore what you need to do is bring on it a mabul, like wash it away. Totally get rid of the bad. However, when getting rid of the bad, remember the quality of Avrohom. Don't just totally destroy the past and do away with everything and totally erase everything, but always look for the good qualities that are in there that you could elevate, so to speak, and bring out of them a true, quote, existence to the world. Make them exist, inject quality into what the past that you had that may have not been so good, that to use it and now to redirect it, so to speak, to do good and to bring a sustenance, a true good qualitative existence to yourself and to the world.